I want to tell you what a hospital bill looks like when you're 68 years old and the number at the bottom is $47,000. I want to tell you what it looks like because I sat in my kitchen in Louisville, Kentucky, and looked at it for a long time, the way you look at something you cannot process, and the number just stayed there being a number. And I thought, this is what it means to be sick in America when you're old, and not quite old enough, and not quite broke enough, and not quite anything enough to have anyone help you. The hospital stay was 7 days. Cardiac event. Not a full heart attack, I said, which felt like the universe offering a discount I hadn't asked for. They said the stent procedure had gone well. They sent me home with a bag of medications and instructions and a bill for $47,000, of which my Medicare supplement covered $31,000, and the balance was mine. $16,000 for 7 days of being alive. I was 68 and I had been retired for 3 years, and I had been living carefully on my Social Security of $980 and a pension from the Louisville Metro government, where I'd spent 26 years in the planning department, a pension of $720, and together they made $1,700 a month, and I had been doing fine with that, carefully fine, until the bill. After the bill, I was not fine. After the bill, I was a 68-year-old man with a new stent in his heart and $16,000 of debt and a bottle of medication that the insurance didn't fully cover and which cost me $240 a month, and a country that had just demonstrated very precisely how much my survival was worth in its accounting. My name is Charles Odom. And I'm telling you this from an apartment in Hoi An, Vietnam, a city that has been inhabited for 2,000 years and that is currently inhabited by me on $1,700 a month. And I live here better, physically better, more of my body working, eating better, sleeping better, less afraid than I did at any point in the last decade in Louisville. And I need to tell you how I got here and why America's math drove me out, and what happened when I stopped trying to make the wrong numbers work and started asking where the right numbers were. Let me tell you the before, the full before, because context matters, and because I think some people watching this will see themselves in it. I grew up in Louisville, spent my whole life there, more or less. The planning department job was good work. I helped design how a city grows, where infrastructure goes, how the zoning shapes the life that happens inside it. It was not glamorous, but it had a kind of quiet significance that suited me. My wife, Margaret, died when I was 64, cancer. Pancreatic. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which the doctor said was fast, and which I am still 4 years later not sure how to process, because the speed of it didn't leave room for adjustment, only for presence, only for being there as hard as I could be there for 6 weeks, and then standing in a house that had the absence of someone in every room. We had no children. Margaret and I had talked about it early in our marriage and made a different choice, and I do not regret it. But I will tell you that in the years after she died, the absence of children was the shape of the loneliness, not blame. The shape of being alone. My brothers are in Louisville. My friends are in Louisville. And I was in Louisville, and everything should have been enough for that to constitute a life. But the math kept not working. The medications, the maintenance of a house I didn't need alone, and eventually sold to move into an apartment. The apartment, the costs of being one person where there used to be two people, and the fixed costs didn't have with the person. And then the cardiac event and the bill and $16,000, and a country that had very clearly communicated its position on the value of my continued existence. I had always meant to see Vietnam. This is an odd thing for a man of my generation to say, because Vietnam, for men of my generation, means something specific, means the war, means the draft lottery, means the defining emergency of the age we came of age in. I was not drafted. I had a high number in the lottery, and I went to college, and I watched from a distance while others didn't get to. That distance has its own kind of weight. I started reading about Vietnam in my 50s, reading history, reading travel writing, reading the accounts of veterans who had gone back and who had found something there that complicated and deepened what the war had meant. And the Vietnam that I read about was not the war. It was a country, a very old country with a very long memory, and a people who had, by every account I read, a particular resilience and warmth that I found myself drawn to in a way I couldn't fully articulate. And then after the bill, after $16,000 and $240 medication, and the clear-eyed calculation of what the next 20 years of health care would cost in America, I started looking, not dreaming, looking. I am a planning department man. I look at the numbers and find the structural solutions, and the numbers coming back from Vietnam were not possible. The numbers coming back from Vietnam looked like someone had made a mistake. And then I looked again, and they were right. And then I looked a third time because I wanted to be sure, and they were still right. And I sat at my kitchen table in Louisville with the $47,000 bill somewhere in the paperwork pile and the numbers in front of me, and I thought, the structure is not in Louisville. The structure that makes my life viable is somewhere else, and somewhere else was Vietnam. I want to talk about the resistance before I talk about the going, because the resistance was significant and real, and I think if I don't honor it, I'm not being honest with you. I am 68 years old. I am a man of a generation that was raised to associate Vietnam with loss, with grief, with the specific American tragedy of that time. Going to Vietnam to live felt at first like something I had to think through very carefully before I was sure I wasn't doing something that dishonored the men who didn't come home. I thought about this for weeks, and what I arrived at was this: the country and the war are not the same thing. The war is in the history. The country is in the present. Going to Vietnam is not about the war any more than going to Germany is about World War II. It's about a place that exists now, with people in it now, and the choice to participate in that. And I found a book, I found it in those weeks of thinking, called You Were Never Meant to Stay. And I want to tell you what it did for my specific situation, because my situation was different from most. It wasn't about fear of the unknown. I'm a planner. I'd planned. It was about a kind of guilt, a feeling that leaving Louisville, leaving the brothers and the small circle of people who'd known Margaret, was abandoning something. The book, without ever touching my specific situation, touched the exact root of it. The difference between loyalty and imprisonment, between honoring what was and being trapped by what was. The difference between staying because it's right and staying because leaving requires deciding who you are without the context you've always been in. That's harder than it sounds. The link is in the description. The book is worth every page. My brother Dennis, the younger one, the one I'm closest to, is the person who made it possible for me to actually leave. I told him in February over the phone that I was thinking about Vietnam, that I had done the research and the math worked, and I wanted to go see if it was real. He was quiet for a moment. Dennis is an accountant. He understands numbers. And he said, "Send me the spreadsheet." And I did. And he called me back in 2 hours and said, "Charles, if you stay in Louisville, in 5 years you're eating into principal, and in 10 years you're in serious trouble. If these Vietnam numbers are accurate, you're sustainable indefinitely." Indefinitely. That word from my accountant brother changed something. He helped me with the logistics. He drove me to the airport in March. He stood at the departures entrance of Louisville International and shook my hand and said, "Go live, Charles. Margaret would have gone with you." And I said I knew that. And I did. I landed in Da Nang and took a taxi to Hoi An because I had read about Hoi An and seen photographs and thought, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it in a place that gives me something to look at as while I figure it out. Hoi An is a UNESCO World Heritage City. The old town is a preserved trading port from the 15th through 19th centuries. Wooden merchant houses, temples, covered bridges, lanterns everywhere you look, and a river that reflects the lanterns at night in a way that makes you stop walking and just stand there. I walked into the old town on my first evening in the country, still jet-lagged, still uncertain, still carrying the weight of $16,000 in medical debt that I was leaving behind in the conceptual sense, even if not the literal sense. And I stood on the Japanese-covered bridge over the canal and watched the lanterns on the water and heard the city around me and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that I was in a place that was not making demands of me. Louisville was full of demands. Every bill was a demand. Every medication cost was a demand. Every calculation of how long the money would hold was a demand. And Hoi An, in the lantern light, just was. It just existed. And for that moment I existed in it without anything being required. The numbers, I owe them to you precisely because they are the reason I'm here, and because someone watching this needs them to be real and to check them. Monthly income, Social Security $980, pension $720, total $1,700, housing. I found an apartment in a quiet neighborhood about a 10-minute walk from the old town. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a small balcony that looks over a courtyard with a frangipani tree. Fully furnished, clean, modern, rent 5 million Vietnamese dong per month. At the current exchange rate, approximately $215. $215 for a 2-bedroom apartment in a UNESCO heritage city. I will pause and let you do whatever you need to do with that number. Utilities. Electricity, which I run air conditioning in the hottest months, averages about $40. Water, $8. Internet, $12. Phone with a local SIM and data, $10. Total housing and utilities, about $285 a month. Healthcare. This is the part that will matter most to people who are where I was. Vietnam has both public and private healthcare options. I use a combination. For routine care, I go to a family clinic near my apartment where a consultation with an English-speaking doctor costs about $15. Not a copay. The full cost of the visit. $15. For anything more significant, there is a modern private hospital in Da Nang, 30 minutes away, that has international standard care and where my blood pressure management, including the visit, The monitoring and the medication costs me about $30 a month. My cardiac medication that was $240 a month in Louisville is available here for about $22 for the same drug at the same dosage. $22. I want to be very direct with you about what this means. The medication that is keeping me alive costs $22 a month here. I pay for a private health insurance supplemental policy as well, which costs about $60 a month and covers major procedures and hospitalization. Total health cost, including the insurance and all medications and routine visits, about $110. In Louisville, with Medicare supplement, effectively unlimited in its threat, as the $47,000 bill had demonstrated. Food. Hoi An is a food city. It is known for it internationally. Dishes that were developed here over centuries are specific to this place and cannot be made properly anywhere else, and I eat them almost every day. Chow Lao, a noodle dish with pork and greens and a broth that requires the specific water of Hoi An's wells, so they say, to be right. White rose dumplings. Banh mi from the carts near the market. Fresh seafood from the river. I spend about $160 a month on food, eating out most days, eating like a person who has remembered what it means to eat, not just to fuel. Total monthly spending, housing and utilities $285, healthcare $110, food $160, transportation, mostly bicycle and occasional taxi, $40, everything else, a haircut for $3, a beer for $1, temple offerings, market purchases, museum entrance fees, $150. Grand total, about $745 a month. My income is $1,700. I have $955 left every month. $955. I am paying down the $16,000 medical debt. It will be gone in 17 months. Let me tell you about the people and the place, because the arithmetic is only part of it and the smaller part. Hoi An has an expat community, not huge, but real. And I found it through a coffee shop where several of us ended up at the same time on a rainy afternoon and started talking the way people do when they're all doing the same improbable thing and have questions nobody back home can answer. There's a retired teacher from Wisconsin named Phil, a former social worker from Oregon named Jan, a couple from Michigan who moved here 2 years ago and who have the ease of people who fully landed. And there are the Vietnamese neighbors, the family next door whose grandmother, who I will call Ba, which means grandmother and is what everyone calls her, has appointed herself responsible for my nutrition and who knocks on my door twice a week with food she's made, a soup or a sweet, a plate of fruit, and who accepts nothing in return except for me to eat it in front of her and make a face that indicates satisfaction, which I do not have to perform. Ba is 84 years old and has been in this city her entire life and survived things I will never fully understand. And she looks at me with the same warmth she looks at her grandchildren, which I take to be one of the more generous gifts a person can receive. I made mistakes. The first month I was here, I mixed up the units of Vietnamese currency approximately 40 times and grossly overpaid for several things because the zeros are confusing. There are a lot of them. 100,000 dong is about $4. And when you're used to dollars, the number of zeros makes your brain miscalculate. I gave a driver, a motorcycle taxi driver, about 8 times what the ride cost because I misread the bills. He was very honest and gave back the overage, and I was so embarrassed that I tipped him the overage anyway, and he looked at me with an expression I'm choosing to interpret as fond. The food had its moments. The first time I tried the banh mi from a street cart, which I had been told was good, I learned that good in this context meant this is among the finest things you have ever put in your mouth, and I stood on the sidewalk eating it and startling the cart vendor, who was perfectly used to her food being good and was not expecting a 68-year-old American to have a visible emotional response to a sandwich. She was gracious about it. She sold me another one. I should tell you about the river. Hoi An has a river, the Thuban, and in the evening, especially in the dry season, the river is where the city goes. Vendors and food carts and families and couples and fishermen checking their nets, and somewhere always someone with a speaker playing music that drifts across the water. I walk along the river most evenings. I walked along it in December with Dennis, who came to visit for 2 weeks. He arrived skeptical, as accountants arrive at most things, and he left with a bag of coffee and local silk and a look on his face that I recognized as the look of a man recalculating something. He said at the airport, "Charles, you've done the math. You've actually done the math." Yes, that's what I do. I'm a planning department man. I should tell you about what happened with the cardiac situation here. About 8 months after arriving, I had a checkup at the Da Nang Hospital. Full cardiac workup, EKG, echocardiogram, stress test, blood work. The cost of the full workup was $420, which my insurance covered most of, leaving me about $60 out of pocket. The cardiologist, who trained at a hospital in Singapore and whose English was excellent, reviewed everything and told me that my numbers were significantly better than the baseline I'd brought from Louisville. My blood pressure, which had been difficult to control, was now in an ideal range. My weight had dropped 11 pounds without me trying to lose weight, because the food here is different, fresher, less processed, and because I walk everywhere. He said, and I wrote this down because I wanted to remember it exactly, "You are doing better than most men your age in this region, and considerably better than the data for American men your age. American men my age." He said that. I went home and sat on my balcony and watched the frangipani tree and thought about $47,000 and $240 a month for medication, and a country that had calculated precisely what my survival was worth. And I thought about $22 for the same medication and a $60 checkup, and a cardiologist who said my numbers were good, and a frangipani tree, and Ba knocking on my door with soup. The math was clear. If you are watching this, and you are where I was, if you have a bill you can't pay, and medication you're calculating whether you can afford, and a country that seems to have done the arithmetic on your survival and found the number inconvenient, I want to tell you something direct. The math does not have to be done in America. The math can be done somewhere else, and doing it somewhere else is not giving up, and it is not giving in, and it is not weakness. It is solving the equation with different variables, which is what planners do, which is what I did for 26 years, and which turns out to be the most practical and most radical thing I have ever done in my life. And the book, You Were Never Meant to Stay. If today you recognize something, if my story landed somewhere specific, read it. The link is in the description. It helped me understand that leaving was not what I was afraid it was. It was the most careful, considered, and structurally sound decision I had ever made. Come find the covered bridge. Come find the river in the evening. Come find the banh mi cart near the market and eat one on the sidewalk. You may have an emotional response. The cart vendor has seen it before. She will be very gracious about it.